All right, thank you all so much for being here today. I'm just going to get us started, and hopefully some more folks will join us soon. So thank you so much for joining us for today's session, From Conflict to Classroom, the Refugee Journey and Building Belonging in Schools, in PA Schools. I'm Megan Dale from the Center for Schools and Communities, and this session is being offered as part of our PA Refugee Education Program's learning series, Together We're Better. Our session today is led by Durre Sharif, the Associate Director of Resettlement at Church World Services, or CWS, Harrisburg. Durre is a dedicated advocate for cross-cultural understanding and community building. Born and raised in London to Pakistani and Tanzanian parents, she majored in English literature and spent 6 years teaching in London, significantly impacting her students' lives. As a member of the Ahmadi Muslim community, Durre has seen firsthand the transformative effects of refugee resettlement on persecuted individuals. And after moving to the United States, Durre dedicated herself to advocating for Muslims and promoting diversity. She served as a youth mentor, nurturing future leaders and fostering an inclusive environment. And in 2021, Durre volunteered as an interpreter for CWS Harrisburg, assisting Afghan refugees resettling in the area following the fall of Kabul. Inspired by the organization's mission, she quickly became an essential part of their team, and today, Durre is the Associate Director of Resettlement. Her commitment and hard work continue to drive the growth of the organization, and in her current role, she has supported newcomers seeking new beginnings and made a profound impact on the lives of refugee communities. So thank you so much for being here, Durre. So we are a small group today, so I ask that if you're able, that you please participate either verbally or in the chat and engage with us as much as you're able. And as you know, if you've attended any of these sessions before, there will be a session evaluation and an Act 48 application following today's session, and I'll send that in the chat towards the end. Today's session focuses on supporting refugee youth and families as they resettle here in the United States and the kind of overall general refugee journey. Another big thank you to Durre, and I'll pass it over.
Thank you for that introduction, Megan. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm looking forward to spending some time with you all. I want to start off with an apology. I have a cough, so I have a cough sweet in my mouth, so I promise I'm not being rude and chewing gum or anything like that. It's for appropriate reasons that my mouth has something in it. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Project. Where's my little projector button? Okay. So without further ado, from conflict to classroom, the refugee journey, and how we can build belonging. So to get us started, I thought I'd give you a few facts. Right now, there are about 120 million people in the world who are considered forcibly displaced. So what that means is, you know, through no choice of their own, they were forced to flee their home. There are different populations within this that make up this 120 million. You can see that, you know, 31 million, this is as of 2023, are refugees under the United Nations High Commissioner's Residence Mandate. It's a very long-winded way of saying if somebody is fleeing their home, they can go to the UNHCR in the country they flee to and claim refugee status. And when they're awarded that status, they are officially refugees with a capital R. There are also Palestinian refugees who have a separate mandate. A bunch of them are asylum seekers. And then there are other people in need of international protection. And then there are internally displaced people. So these might be people who have had to flee from their home in North Sudan to South Sudan, or from Damascus in Syria to Aleppo in Syria. So the UNHCR, or the Refugee Admissions Program, is a life-saving program, but refugees spend an average of 20 years waiting for their resettlement. What they are told is, you have fled your home, you have reported it to the United Nations, we have designated you refugees, and our promise to you is that when we can, we will help you resettle to a third country. The difference between a refugee and asylum seeker is that when a refugee flees a place and gets to a place of safety and reports themselves to the United Nations office, if they fled Pakistan and gotten to Tanzania, they're not trying to stay in Tanzania. That's just the only place they could get to, and they would like to go to a third place, they are a refugee. If they have fled and managed to get to a place where they want to stay, they are an asylum seeker. So oftentimes when people get flights or when people are able to make it straight to the US, they will go directly to a UN office and they will ask for forgiveness rather than asking for permission. That's the essentially the difference between asylum seekers and refugees. So they get to the US. While they're in the US, they're not eligible for very many things. They can work, but they're not able to access food stamps and other life-saving community resources. That typically takes a couple of years. It's incredibly dangerous to even try to do that. But that's the asylum process. With refugees are told, do this the right way, do this the legal way, and we promise, as a member of the United Nations, to help you when we can. Wait your turn, wait in the queue, and we will get to you. So that's who these refugees are. They are incredibly patient, incredibly trusting, and they are waiting for their opportunity to come to the US. It is a golden ticket. Less than 1% of the 36 million refugees in the world right now actually end up in a third country. So the people that do end up in the US, they have won the lottery. And it's so incredibly exciting to be a part of welcoming them. And that's what you will do every day in the classroom. It's a beautiful thing to be there at the point where somebody has been through the most unimaginable things and you are holding their hands during an opportunity to rebuild. So when refugees flee their home, they've got three options: return to the home country, they can settle in the country to which they fled, or resettlement permanently to a third country. And like I said, less than 1% of people actually end up doing that. And this is a picture of people fleeing Ukraine and crossing over into Romania. So CWS is the agency that I work for. We are the largest refugee resettlement agency in the region. We are now the only refugee resettlement agency left in Harrisburg. There used to be Catholic Charities and Jewish Family Services. It's just us left. We grew from 150 refugees every year in 2022 to 567 in 2024. And we were due to receive 850 this year. Unfortunately, with the President Trump's executive order to ban the refugee resettlement program, we weren't able to reach those targets, but we welcomed just under 400 people before everything shut down. So to give you a broader picture of the United States Refugee Admissions Program, basically what happens is every year, the President of the United States gets to set the refugee admissions ceiling. This means, the maximum number of refugees permitted to enter the US for that year. This happens every year in September, which is the beginning of the new fiscal year, or the end of the new fiscal of the previous fiscal year. So you can see in 1980, which is when the resettlement program in its current form started, it was at just under 240,000 per year. And actually, 210,000 actually came into the US that year. And you can see that, it's gone up and down throughout the years. You can see in around, between 2000 and 2005, the admission ceiling stayed level, but the actual admissions dropped. This was around the time of 9/11. So even if the president keeps the ceiling the same, sometimes the actual admissions are informed by what is going on socially and culturally. And then you can see 2016, there is a very steep drop straight down. This was during President Trump's previous administration, and an even more dramatic height shooting straight up under President Biden's administration. So what you're seeing in schools as educators and in the community is that, you know, we had a very steady bipartisan refugee program. It was believed that the US Refugee Admissions Program was a human right, it was a moral obligation, and it was bipartisan, or it had bipartisan support. In 2016, it became very politicized and confused with illegal immigration or people who are undocumented. The infrastructure, you know, these agencies that have been around for a really long time, in 2016 kind of crashed. You know, they lost a lot of institutional knowledge, a lot of the agencies closed. And then during President Biden's administration, it shot back up again. And the speed at which everything started churning was really, really fast and oftentimes difficult for communities and resettlement agencies to keep up with. So although it's not on here now, basically where the blue line ends, we are now basically straight back down, but all the way to zero is where we stand at the moment. So that's the US Refugee Admissions Program. You know, okay, this is why you sometimes see an influx of refugees and then hardly any refugees and things like that. I want to walk you through the actual process of resettlement. So, like I said, you flee the country where your lives are in danger. So the definition of a refugee is somebody who has had to flee their home country because of a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, political opinion, and so on. So a refugee gets out of that country and goes to the United Nations High Commissioner's residence. When they go there, they submit an application for identification and referral. In Africa, the Refugee Support Center Africa, or the RSC Africa, does some interviews and gives people the refugee status. After that, they are, in some instances, refugees are asked, okay, here are pathways open to you. You can go to Canada or Australia or America. Oftentimes refugees are just told, okay, well, we're putting you in the US track, or we're putting you in the Canada track, or whatever it may be. So after the resettlement, the RSC Africa interviews, a determination is made for which country these refugees will head to. And I can tell you that typically the United States welcomes more refugees than any other country through this UNHCR United Nations program. If the US is taking 60,000 refugees a year, Canada is taking 5,000 refugees a year. So the US Refugee Admissions Program takes 5 years minimum to go through the 4-point FBI background clearances. So this whole snake takes 5 years. In Canada, the snake takes 1 year. Great, but there's such a backlog of people because their numbers are so small. It would take even longer, oftentimes, for people to end up out of displacement and in somewhere like Canada. So oftentimes, the majority of people end up kind of headed in the US direction. So next, after the RSC interviews, USCIS has interviews with them. So this is the US says, okay, you want to come to the US, we're going to interview you. This is the bit that takes 5 years. They do extensive background checks. Refugees who come to the US are the most extensively vetted community in the US and incredibly safe to be around. So after that average 5-year process, if they get approved, they continue through. If they're denied, that's it for them. Typically, if the US deny, then all the other countries will deny as well, because they know that the US has such extensive background checks that if the US have flagged something, they don't want to touch it. So For them, it's a life of displacement. If they're approved, then they go through medical exams, cultural orientation, they travel to the US, and then in the United States, they are received. So what does that mean? No one can come to the US without a sponsor. If a child is sponsoring their parent, they have to sign the documents and the parent comes. If a husband is sponsoring his wife, he needs to sign the papers and say, yes, I agree to be responsible for this person and help them get set up. So it's all, an employer can say, yes, I agree to be responsible for this person and to support them and help them come to the US, etc. And it's no different for the US refugee resettlement process. But in this case, they are agency sponsored. So the US has the government says, yeah, I'm going to let in this many refugees and this is the funding, but we're not going to do it ourselves. We're going to outsource to 10 national nonprofits. Church World Service, the one I work for, is one of them. So then we sign a contract to say, yep, okay, you send us the refugees, we'll go get them. So we go and pick them up from the airport. And then part 2 of the resettlement and integration process. So once refugees arrive in the US, our contracted sponsorship of these families, of supporting them, is a 90-day program, but it's lean. For every individual refugee, we get $1,200. That $1,200 has to pay for everything until they are self-sufficient. So that is paying for their security deposit, for their rent for the first 2 months until they get a job at least. It's paying for clothing, for food until food stamps are approved, kids' shoes, kids' backpacks, everything. It's very, very lean. And this is why oftentimes refugee children that you encounter are wearing secondhand clothes and things like that, because we just have to make do with whatever we can. And this is why community support is so essential. So when they get here, we immediately, provide these necessities, and we put them in housing, sometimes temporary housing. We try our best to connect them with financial aid. Right now, it takes an average of 8 weeks, even if we expedite, to have SNAP benefits approved. After this 90-day reception and placement program, we enroll them in other programs when we can, but really the 90 days isn't enough, and we end up serving our clients pro bono for a few months beyond this day 90 mark, happily. So, barriers for refugee students and impact stories. So, obviously, language is a barrier. I have found that schools are exceptional at getting people up to speed with their language. And it's the most beautiful thing when you see within 2 months, typically, a child become an interpreter for a parent. It's incredible. And that's down to the work of all of you guys. It really is incredible. Cultural adjustment, it takes time, There are a lot of norms in the US that are not norms where they come from. If you imagine that you've spent 25 years in a refugee camp that is literally a tent city without running water, without electricity, and you've had to have non-profits come in and dig water wells for you so that you can survive in these huge tent cities. The cultural adjustment to go from that to norms and standards in the US is monumental. But what is really beautiful is that they understand better than anyone that a good education is a lifesaver. It's a way out, and it's a way to make your lives better. And parents reinforce that over and over again. So we find that refugee children are typically incredibly respectful and very focused on education. And obviously there's interrupted schooling. There are some refugee camps where schooling is available, Oftentimes it's not. Sometimes it's on a lottery system. I've heard of other refugee camps where they do intelligence-based testing. And if there is one child who is remarkably gifted or talented, that child is permitted to go to school. It's very few in number. And then oftentimes that child comes home and becomes the teacher to their own siblings and other children in the camp. So obviously, if schooling does exist, it's very interrupted. So I want to pause there and just read you guys a few impact stories. And this is because I just want to help give an understanding for what's going on at home, circumstances and things that you could to consider when we are interacting to better understand trauma. So as of January 22nd, over 22,000 refugees were considered ready for departure to come to the US, and they had completed all of those necessary background checks I told you about that take a minimum of 5 years, but average, people don't even get into that pool of 22,000 for an average of 20 years. Those are all cancelled. So just a few stories about people who are waiting now for the rest of their family. So Gul S. and his wife were separated from their 4 minor children outside Kabul airport in the chaos of the Afghan evacuation effort in August 2021. After resettling to Massachusetts under Operation Allies Welcome, they began tirelessly working to reunite with their children, who remained overseas and at risk. After being separated for almost 3.5 years, the 4 children were booked to travel on January 23rd, the day after the cancellations began rolling in. Their reunification has now been indefinitely delayed. Zenaida is a refugee who resettled in Texas, who has been trying for years to get her child to safety after many kidnapping attempts. The child's flight was booked to arrive in February. That flight has now been cancelled, and the child's case, which is listed as extremely vulnerable, is now once again delayed. Noor A. is a refugee who resettled in Ohio in 2010 after fleeing civil war in Somalia, and has been waiting to reunite with his son, sister, and mother for almost 15 years. The family was assigned different travel dates, and while his son and sister arrived the week before the ban went into effect, his 70-year-old mother's flight was cancelled unexpectedly on January 22nd as the ban went into place. She is now waiting in limbo, stranded from her children and grandchild. Durre is a single mum with 3 children who have been forcibly displaced and are currently living as refugees in Cairo, Egypt. She was referred to the US Refugee Admissions Program because of her status as a refugee and because she has family already living in New Jersey. She and her children went through the lengthy vetting and screening process and finally had their travel booked to the US, but her flight was among those cancelled by Trump's indefinite refugee admissions ban. The children are 19, 15, and 13. The case file shows the family as survivors of violence and torture. So there are many, many examples like these, and I share these because the depths of the trauma that some of your students are carrying are unfathomable. There's one really, really sweet family living in Harrisburg. They're on North 6th Street in Harrisburg. It's mum and dad. They had two boys. I think they were 6 and 3, and a newborn baby girl. They're from Pakistan. They are part of a persecuted minority community, and they had a shop. And because they dared to have a store, when people found out that they were of this minority community, they started stoning the store, but also them, and they were pretty badly injured. And so they had to flee overnight and leave everything. They didn't know what the circumstances would be when they got to the refugee camp. So they left the newborn baby with the brother in Pakistan. So they got to the refugee camp thinking, okay, 3 to 5 years we'll be reunited with our daughter. We can bear it. We can bear it. A few years go by. They end up having another son. So now they've got 3 boys with a little girl in the middle. They've made it to the US, but it's been 12 years since they saw their daughter, held her. And they just arrived 6 months ago in the US, which is awesome. They were on track to reunite with her, but they can't now because that path to reunite has also been closed. And these children are exceptional. There was a teacher from Harrisburg School District that noticed how exceptional they were and helped the older 2 children be tested and got them into SciTech. They're doing brilliantly. But when you go to their home, there's just this air of sadness, which I'm sure you guys notice all the time, right? You see students, you're like, you're doing well, you've got friends, you know. So just being aware of all of these barriers, being aware that the trauma and the circumstances that they're dealing with are oftentimes unfathomable to us, but just moving with patience and caution and understanding and empathy really is a game changer. So, strategies for supporting refugee students. Create a welcoming environment. I think that educators are often exceptional at that. Provide language support through ESL programs and bilingual resources. It means everything when a teacher, you know, when you're giving a handout to take home, even if it's a permission slip for a field trip, but if it's translated into the language of the parent, for them to not have to rely on their child to do the interpreting and sign the paperwork for them and everything else, that feeling of equity and just being included is really, really weighty. Use trauma-informed teaching to recognize and address the emotional impact of the refugee students' past experiences. Foster peer support and mentoring to help students integrate socially. So, you know, the buddy system's fantastic. We use the buddy system culturally, socially. If we have a family from the Democratic Republic of Congo, we'll make sure to introduce them to other families from the Democratic Republic of Congo, especially those who are a little bit further ahead in having found a job or speaking English and a little bit more established, or the children are doing really well in school. We oftentimes try to make mini communities within the local area. So we'll have pockets of refugee communities in certain areas, which may be why you see some schools will see a heavier Afghan population and other schools see, wait, there are a ton more Sudanese people in our school than what you would expect. Is because we try to cluster the refugees as well. So if something similar could happen in school, we really believe that there's strength in numbers. It helps with discrimination as well, to feel that camaraderie. And build cultural understanding in the classroom. It starts with empathy, but I believe that teachers and educators are very natural at building understanding, but just making it cultural understanding would really make a huge difference. All right, that's it from me. Oh gosh, I'm still sharing. Look at my emails. So I wanted to, so does anyone have any questions? Can we talk a little bit about maybe some of your experiences in the classroom, refugee students that you've had, things that you've noticed, any questions that I can help answer as well?